The rain lashed against the windows of Thornfield Manor as Eleanora Blackwood moved with practiced grace through the grand hall, her slender fingers adjusting the crystal glasses on the dining table that another servant had misplaced. At 25 years of age, she carried herself with a dignity that belied her station, her chestnut hair pulled severely back beneath her cap, her grey eyes downcast as propriety demanded, yet containing a spark of intelligence that no amount of servitude had managed to extinguish. The other servants hurried about in nervous anticipation of the new master, the Duke of Ravenscroft, who would arrive by midday to claim his inheritance, but Eleanora worked with calm precision, her movements betraying years of education far beyond that of a typical lady's maid. 9 years had passed since the fateful carriage accident that claimed her parents and destroyed the once prominent Blackwood family, leaving their daughter presumed dead to society, while in truth, she had survived only to fall into poverty and eventually service in the very house that should have been her birthright. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, noticed Eleanora adjusting the table settings and approached with tight lips and narrowed eyes. "Remember your place, Eleanora," she warned in a hushed tone that nonetheless carried to several nearby servants who paused in their duties to listen. "No one cares about your claims of noble blood, that life is gone." Eleanora merely nodded, her face a perfect mask of submission, while her spine remained straight as a rapier, the subtle signs of her true breeding visible only to those who knew what to look for in the perfect angle of her wrists as she arranged flowers, or the impeccable diction that occasionally slipped through despite her efforts to blend in with the other staff. The austere walls of Thornfield Manor seemed to watch her with the same cold judgment they had shown since she arrived 3 years prior, the dark wood paneling absorbing what little light penetrated the rain clouds, the ancestral portraits lining the gallery staring down with painted eyes that sometimes, in certain light, appeared to recognize her. Whispers followed Eleanora throughout the house, tales of her occasional lapses where she would correct the butler on the proper wine for a particular dish, or instinctively reach to receive guests, as if she were the lady of the house rather than its servant, small betrayals of her hidden identity as the true heir to Thornfield, the rightful Duchess whose title and lands had been stolen through her uncle's machinations when she was too young and grief-stricken to fight. The great clock in the entrance hall struck 10, its solemn chimes echoing through corridors that had once rung with the laughter of her childhood, before tragedy and treachery had rewritten her story from nobility to servitude. As the staff lined up for final inspection before the Duke's arrival, Eleanora took her place at the end of the row, eyes forward, hands clasped, her heart beating a steady rhythm of patience beneath her plain black dress. Soon she would meet the man who unknowingly possessed everything that should have been hers, the latest player in a game of deception he had not chosen but nonetheless benefited from, and despite years of rehearsing this moment in her mind, she found herself unexpectedly afraid, not of him, but of herself, and what emotions might betray her when finally face to face with the living embodiment of all she had lost. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows of Thornfield Manor, casting jeweled patterns across the marble floors as the grandfather clock struck 3, its resonant chimes echoing through the cavernous entrance hall, where the staff stood in perfect formation to greet their new master. Duke Alexander Ravenscroft strode through the massive oak doors like a conquering general, his broad shoulders squared beneath an impeccably tailored coat, his raven hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, handsome yet cold, with eyes the color of a winter sea that betrayed nothing of the man beneath the title. At 30, he carried himself with the confidence of one accustomed to command, his bearing shaped by years of military service and the weight of family obligation that had fallen upon him following the unexpected deaths of his father and elder brother. The butler stepped forward with a deep bow, welcoming the Duke to Thornfield, but Alexander hardly seemed to register the words, his gaze sweeping the assembled staff with cool assessment until it paused, almost imperceptibly, on Eleanora, standing at the end of the line. Something in her posture, the way she held her head perhaps, or the stillness with which she awaited introduction, caught his attention like a false note in a familiar melody. When her turn came to curtsy, She performed the gesture with such perfect, fluid grace that the Duke paused, his eyes narrowing with an instinctive suspicion he could not immediately name or justify. Later, as Eleanora served tea in the library, Alexander watched her pour with precise movements that spoke of familiarity with fine things, her soft voice presenting each dish with flawless diction. His irritation grew as she moved about the room, her knowledge of its contents becoming apparent when she retrieved a requested book without hesitation from shelves she should not have known so intimately. The tension culminated in the portrait gallery, where Alexander found himself inexplicably drawn to a particular painting of a young woman whose eyes held a strange familiarity. That is the fourth Duchess of Thornfield, Elizabeth Blackwood, painted in 1790, Eleanora offered quietly when she noticed his interest, her voice dropping unconsciously into the educated tones of her youth. She was known for her patronage of the arts and establishing the extensive library for which Thornfield is still renowned. Alexander turned sharply, his expression darkening at this unsolicited history lesson from a mere servant. "You are nothing but a servant," he sneered, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the gallery. "Know your place." The words struck Eleanora like physical blows, each syllable a reminder of all she had lost, all that had been taken from her, yet she maintained her composure, only a momentary flash of fire in her grey eyes betraying the depth of her response before she lowered them submissively. "As you wish, Your Grace," she replied with another perfect curtsy, her voice modulated to appropriate civility, even as her heart hammered against her ribs with suppressed rage and something more complex. A strange awareness of him as a man, rather than merely the usurper of her birthright. The rain continued to lash against the windows, the darkening sky outside mirroring the oppressive tension within, as the staff exchanged nervous glances, sensing the peculiar undercurrent between their new master and the lady's maid who carried herself like a queen. Alexander dismissed her with a wave of his hand, yet found his gaze following her retreating figure, drawn by an inexplicable sense that there was far more to Eleanora Blackwood than a servant with ideas above her station. A mystery his logical mind could not yet comprehend, but that tugged at his awareness nonetheless, like a melody half-remembered from childhood, familiar yet frustratingly out of reach. Moonlight spilled through the tiny dormer window of Eleanora's attic chamber, casting long shadows across the sparse furnishings as she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, listening to ensure the house had fallen silent for the night. The room was barely large enough to contain the iron bedstead, a weathered washstand, and the battered trunk that held her few possessions, yet in this humble space she found the only privacy afforded to her in what should have been her ancestral home. With careful fingers, Eleanora slid from her dress pocket a small key worn smooth from years of handling, then knelt before her trunk, her movements deliberate and practiced as she unlocked it and shifted aside the meager collection of plain dresses and white aprons that comprised her wardrobe as a lady's maid. Pressing against a nearly invisible seam along the trunk's inner wall, she triggered a mechanism that released a hidden compartment, revealing treasures that stood in stark contrast to her current circumstances: a gold signet ring bearing the Blackwood family crest, miniature portraits of her parents in ornate frames, and most precious of all, a leather folio containing documents that proved beyond doubt her identity as Eleanora Victoria Blackwood, rightful Duchess of Thornfield. Lifting the ring, she slipped it onto her finger where it caught the moonlight and seemed to transform her from servant to nobility in an instant, the weight of it familiar yet painful, a physical reminder of all she had lost when her uncle, Lord Harwick, conspired with the previous Duke of Ravenscroft to declare her dead alongside her parents, spreading vicious rumors about questionable bloodlines to discredit any claim she might make should she ever reappear. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as memories flooded back of that terrible night 9 years ago, when at 16 she had fled for her life, warned by a loyal servant that her uncle sought to eliminate her permanently rather than merely disinherit her, forcing her to disappear into the anonymous masses of London until she could return to Thornfield under a false identity, working as a servant in her own home while gathering evidence of the conspiracy that had robbed her of everything. "I will reclaim what is mine," she whispered fiercely into the darkness, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of her father's portrait, not through scandal or revenge, but by finding the truth. Thornfield will know its rightful Duchess again. The moonlight seemed to intensify as she spoke, illuminating her face with an almost ethereal glow that revealed the noble bone structure so carefully concealed during daylight hours. The proud tilt of her chin and the intelligent determination in her eyes marking her as unmistakably aristocratic, despite her humble surroundings. One by one, she returned her treasures to their hiding place, each item a piece of her true identity carefully preserved against the day when she could reclaim her birthright. Yet tonight her thoughts kept returning to the new Duke, whose icy demeanor had both infuriated and intrigued her, the man who unknowingly held the title that should have been her family legacy. Alexander Ravenscroft was clearly not the architect of the deception that had stolen her inheritance. His own father, having kept him away at school and then in military service while the conspiracy unfolded, making him an unwitting beneficiary rather than an active participant in her downfall, a realization that complicated her feelings toward him in ways she had not anticipated when planning her return to Thornfield. Closing the hidden compartment with a soft click, Eleanora rose and moved to the window, gazing out over the moonlit grounds of the estate she knew intimately from childhood, her reflection in the glass wavering between the lady's maid she appeared to be and the Duchess she truly was, two identities separated by cruel circumstance, yet united in a single, unwavering purpose that would require all her courage, intelligence, and restraint to fulfill without destroying the very legacy she sought to reclaim. Thunder shook the windows of Thornfield Manor as lightning illuminated the library in harsh flashes, the tempest outside providing dramatic counterpoint to the sanctuary within, where ancient leather tomes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and a generous fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across the polished oak shelves. Duke Alexander Ravenscroft strode into his library well after midnight, seeking solitude and perhaps solace in literature after a fortnight of frustrating estate business that left him restless and unable to sleep despite the lateness of the hour, only to find the room already occupied by a slender figure curled in his favorite wingback chair, so absorbed in reading that she remained unaware of his presence until he deliberately cleared his throat, causing Eleanora to start violently and nearly drop the gilt-edged volume cradled in her hands. "Your Grace," she exclaimed, rising swiftly and clutching the book to her chest like a shield, her grey eyes wide with alarm as she realized her transgression. "I beg your forgiveness for the intrusion. I thought everyone had retired for the night." Alexander opened his mouth to deliver the stinging reprimand, such presumption deserved from a servant, only to find his attention caught by the title visible on the spine of the book she held. A rare first edition of Dante's Inferno in the original Italian that few in his acquaintance could read, much less appreciate. "How does a lady's maid know Dante in the original Italian?" he asked instead, genuine curiosity temporarily overriding his indignation as he stepped closer, noting with increasing interest the intelligent comprehension in her eyes rather than the blank confusion such a question should elicit from someone of her station. "Perhaps, Your Grace, not all are born to the station in which you find them," she replied carefully, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly, betraying a dignity at odds with her plain black dress and white cap. Something in her measured response and the quiet defiance in her gaze compelled Alexander to extend the conversation rather than dismiss her. His own extensive education, recognizing a kindred intellect despite the inexplicable circumstances. "Tell me your thoughts on the text," he challenged, gesturing for her to sit as he took the opposite chair, his eyes never leaving her face as she hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of revealing too much against the unexpected opportunity to engage with the literature she so clearly treasured. Her response, when it came, was nothing short of revelatory, a thoughtful analysis of Dante's allegory that demonstrated not only fluency in Italian, but a sophisticated understanding of medieval philosophy and religious symbolism that left Alexander momentarily speechless. His anger transformed to fascination as they moved from Dante to Shakespeare, then to Milton, their discussion growing increasingly animated as the storm raged outside, creating an intimate bubble of intellectual communion, unlike anything he had experienced in the formal drawing rooms of London society. "You speak as one educated at Oxford, not as a servant," he observed when she passionately defended a controversial interpretation of Hamlet, her cheeks flushed with the fervor of intellectual engagement, her carefully maintained servant's diction having given way to the cultivated accents of aristocracy. Eleanora froze, suddenly aware of how completely she had lowered her guard, allowing her true self to emerge through the disguise she had so carefully maintained. The storm chose that moment to unleash a particularly violent thunderclap that shook the very foundations of Thornfield, the lights flickering precariously as she struggled to reconstruct her defenses under Alexander's increasingly perceptive scrutiny. "My father believed all should have access to knowledge regardless of birth," she offered finally, the partial truth easier to sustain than complete fabrication, especially under the intensity of Alexander's gaze, which now held something beyond mere curiosity, a reluctant admiration mixed with deepening suspicion that both thrilled and terrified her. As lightning illuminated the library once more, Alexander found himself studying the woman before him with new eyes, noting how the scholarly discussion had transformed her from invisible servant to compelling woman, her intelligence and passion rendering her beautiful in ways conventional prettiness could never achieve, while Eleanora realized with equal dismay that their literary debate had revealed not the cold, arrogant usurper she had expected, but a man of genuine intellectual depth and unexpected complexity, complicating her carefully laid plans in ways she had not foreseen when she first infiltrated her childhood home in search of justice. Crystal chandeliers cast brilliant light across Thornfield Manor's grand dining room, their faceted pendants throwing dazzling patterns over damask tablecloths and fine china, as 30 of society's most distinguished guests gathered for the first formal dinner hosted by the new Duke of Ravenscroft. Footmen in livery moved with choreographed precision between courses, silver trays balanced effortlessly as they served delicacies prepared by the French chef Alexander had brought from London specifically for the occasion. The opulence of the setting, designed to establish his position among the local gentry, while simultaneously honoring the ancient traditions of the estate he had inherited. Eleanora moved efficiently among the guests in her role as lady's maid to Mrs. Hertford, the elderly dowager seated at Alexander's left, her eyes carefully downcast. Her movements deliberately unremarkable as she navigated the familiar room now filled with people who had once been her parents' friends and peers, none of whom showed the slightest recognition of the daughter they had presumed dead for 9 years. The careful anonymity Eleanora had cultivated shattered, however, when the butler announced a late arrival. Lord Reginald Harwick, the distinguished gentleman, offers his deepest apologies for the delay. "Your Grace." Eleanora felt the blood drain from her face as her uncle entered the dining room, his silver hair immaculately styled, his smile benevolent and charming as he greeted Alexander, with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to moving in the highest circles, the very picture of respectability that belied the calculated cruelty with which he had orchestrated her parents' deaths and her own disinheritance. Years of practiced control nearly abandoned her when Lord Harwick glanced in her direction as she served the next course, his gaze passing over her initially, then returning with narrowed intensity, a flicker of confusion crossing his features as some shadow of recognition stirred in his memory. The serving dish in Eleanora's hands trembled imperceptibly, her knuckles whitening with the effort to maintain her composure as her uncle continued to stare, his brow furrowing with the effort to place her face among his recollections. Alexander, seated at the head of the table, noticed the peculiar tableau, his gaze sharpening as he observed the uncharacteristic distress in Eleanora's usually composed demeanor, the subtle but unmistakable tension between his servant and his distinguished guest. "Something about that girl reminds me of someone," Lord Harwick mused aloud, interrupting his conversation with the Countess beside him. "Someone long dead." "Indeed, how fascinating," Alexander replied, his tone casual but his eyes keenly observant as they moved between Eleanora and Harwick, noting how she seemed to hold her breath under the older man's scrutiny. "Mrs. Hertford requires fresh tea, Eleanora," Alexander said suddenly, creating an excuse to remove her from the increasingly dangerous situation. "Please see to it immediately." Gratitude flashed briefly in Eleanora's eyes, as she curtsied and withdrew from the dining room, her usual grace momentarily compromised by the haste with which she sought escape. While Lord Harwick shook his head dismissively, the resemblance merely a trick of the light, he assured himself aloud, "Eleanora Blackwood perished alongside her parents. God rest their souls." Alexander watched the exchange with growing suspicion, filing away both Harwick's comment and Eleanora's reaction for future consideration, his intellectual curiosity piqued by the mysterious undercurrents flowing beneath the surface of the seemingly straightforward dinner party. When Eleanora returned several minutes later, her composure restored, though her complexion remained paler than usual, Alexander found his attention drawn repeatedly to her throughout the remainder of the evening, observing how she carefully maintained maximum distance from Lord Harwick while performing her duties with mechanical precision. All the natural grace and subtle animation he had come to notice in her movements now suppressed beneath rigid self-control. Later, as the guests departed into the mild spring evening, carriages rolling down the gravel drive beneath a canopy of stars, Alexander stood in the entrance hall bidding farewell to Lord Harwick with perfect courtesy while his mind catalogued the peculiar connection between the aristocrat and his lady's maid, adding this new puzzle piece to the growing collection of inconsistencies surrounding the remarkable woman who had captured his attention in ways that extended far beyond the appropriate interest of a master in a servant. Dawn light filtered through wisps of mist that clung to the rose garden of Thornfield Manor, transforming ordinary blooms into ethereal creations adorned with crystal droplets of dew that caught the first golden rays of sunrise. Eleanora moved quietly among the flowers, pruning shears in hand as she performed her early morning tasks before the household fully awakened, finding solace in the familiar ritual that connected her to happier memories of helping her mother tend these same gardens in what seemed another lifetime. The encounter with Lord Harwick the previous evening had left her shaken, the danger of recognition far more immediate than she had anticipated during her careful planning, and the peaceful solitude of the garden offered much-needed respite to calm her frayed nerves and reconsider her strategy. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she failed to notice Alexander approaching until his shadow fell across the rosebush she was tending, his unexpected presence causing her to straighten abruptly, nearly pricking her finger on a concealed thorn. "Your Grace," she acknowledged with a curtsy, her voice carefully modulated though her heart raced with apprehension at finding herself alone with him after the events of the dinner party. "I find myself unusually early to rise this morning," Alexander said, his tone conversational yet purposeful as his keen eyes assessed her reaction, "and in need of clarity regarding a rather curious interaction I observed last evening between yourself and Lord Harwick." Eleanora felt cold fear wash through her veins despite the warming morning air, the direct question threatening to unravel her careful disguise before she had gathered sufficient evidence to prove her claim. "I am not acquainted with his lordship," she responded carefully, her eyes lowered to the dewy grass beneath their feet. "Yet he seemed quite fixated on you," Alexander countered softly, moving closer until barely an arm's length separated them, "and your discomfort was evident to anyone paying attention, which I find I have been doing with increasing frequency where you are concerned, Miss Blackwood." The use of her surname, so casually mentioned yet carrying the weight of her true identity, caused Eleanora to raise her eyes to his in alarm, finding not accusation in his gaze but genuine concern mingled with curiosity. "I believe you were born to more than this," Alexander admitted, gesturing to her servant's attire, "and I believe Lord Harwick has wronged you somehow. I find I cannot bear that thought." The unexpected compassion in his voice momentarily stripped Eleanora of her practiced defenses, the truth hovering dangerously close to her lips before caution reasserted itself. "Why would a duke concern himself with a servant's troubles?" she asked softly, her voice betraying more vulnerability than she had intended. "Because I have come to care what happens to you," he replied with disarming honesty, his hand moving to cover hers where it rested on the handle of the pruning shears, the simple contact sending an unexpected jolt of awareness through them both, causing Alexander to draw back slightly in surprise, while Eleanora fought to control her quickening breath. Under the weight of his steady gaze and the lingering warmth of his touch, Eleanora found herself offering a partial truth, her words carefully chosen to reveal without exposing her full identity. "I was born to a respectable family," she admitted quietly. "My father was a gentleman of good standing before financial ruin and death left me alone in the world. Lord Harwick was." She hesitated, seeking the right words, "acquainted with my family, and played some role in our downfall, though I was too young to understand the full extent of his actions at the time." Alexander listened intently, his expression shifting from suspicion to protective concern as she spoke, the pieces of her story aligning with his own observations of her unusual refinement, while still leaving much unexplained. "I shall look into Lord Harwick's dealings," he promised impulsively, his voice low and fierce with unexpected protectiveness. "No one under my protection shall suffer continued injustice, especially not someone of your," he paused, searching for the right word, "exceptional quality." The mist began to burn away around them as the sun rose higher, illuminating dewdrops on rose petals like scattered diamonds, the tranquil garden bearing witness to this fragile new understanding between them. No longer master and servant, but two people standing on the cusp of an alliance. Neither had anticipated, while beneath their cautious words and careful distance flowed a current of attraction both were reluctant to acknowledge, yet increasingly powerless to deny. Summer sunlight filtered through dusty windows in the London solicitor's office as Alexander Ravenscroft leaned forward across the polished mahogany desk, his voice low but insistent, as he questioned the elderly Mr. Whitfield about the legal specifics of his inheritance, the first of many inquiries that would occupy the Duke over the coming weeks, as he methodically pursued the truth behind Eleanora's cryptic revelations in the rose garden. The investigation led him from the formal elegance of legal chambers to the stifling confines of county record offices where ancient ledgers yielded their secrets reluctantly, the musty scent of forgotten documents filling his nostrils as he pored over birth records, death certificates, and land transfers that gradually revealed a pattern of suspicious timing and questionable transactions surrounding the supposed extinction of the Blackwood line. Meanwhile, at Thornfield, Eleanora utilized her knowledge of the manor's hidden spaces to conduct her own search, using precious moments of solitude to access concealed compartments in the library paneling that her father had shown her as a child, where family records had been stored for generations, her fingers trembling with both anticipation and fear as she discovered correspondence between her uncle and the previous Duke that confirmed their conspiracy to usurp her inheritance while she was believed dead. "If the Blackwood line did not end as I was told, then whose title do I truly hold?" Alexander demanded during a particularly tense meeting with his family solicitor, the evidence of manipulation becoming increasingly difficult to ignore as he connected disparate pieces of information gathered over weeks of discreet investigation. "Your Grace, some matters are better left in the past, Mr." Pembroke responded, discomfort evident in his shifting posture and refusal to meet Alexander's steady gaze, suggesting complicity in whatever deception had occurred nearly a decade earlier. At Ravenscroft House in London, Alexander discovered his late father's private journal locked in a secret drawer of his desk, the entries describing with disturbing pragmatism the opportunity presented by the tragic death of the Blackwood couple and the disappearance of their daughter, presumed dead though no body had ever been recovered. The casual mention of this critical detail causing Alexander's blood to run cold as he considered the implications. During these same weeks, the relationship between Alexander and Eleanora evolved in subtle yet significant ways, their occasional encounters in the library or gardens charged with unspoken understanding, their conversations ostensibly proper, yet underscored with growing mutual respect and dangerous attraction that complicated Eleanora's resolve to reclaim her birthright regardless of personal feelings. One particularly significant discovery came when Alexander made an unannounced visit to the abandoned Blackwood estate, now fallen into disrepair, where he found himself standing before a family portrait, in which a young girl of perhaps 12 or 13 gazed back at him with the same grey eyes that had increasingly haunted his thoughts. the undeniable resemblance to Eleanora sending a shock of recognition through him that crystallized his growing suspicions into near certainty. Even as the truth began to take shape in Alexander's mind, Eleanora uncovered the final piece of evidence she had been seeking, a legal document bearing the signatures of both her father and the previous Duke of Ravenscroft, detailing the specific terms of entailment that bound Thornfield to the Blackwood bloodline in perpetuity, making her not merely the rightful owner of the estate, but the legitimate holder of the title that Alexander now possessed. A revelation that should have brought triumph, but instead filled her with conflicted emotions as she considered the man whose life would be upended by her claim, a man whose intelligence, integrity, and unexpected kindness had gradually transformed him in her eyes from usurper to unwitting victim of the same conspiracy that had destroyed her family. Standing in the great gallery of Thornfield one evening as summer rain pattered against the windows, Alexander studied the portrait of Elizabeth Blackwood that Eleanora had identified on his first day, noting with new awareness the familial resemblance that connected the long-dead Duchess to the remarkable woman who had entered his life disguised as a servant, yet had slowly, inexorably captured both his intellectual respect and his reluctant heart, the weight of approaching revelation hanging heavy in the air like the gathering storm clouds outside, promising both cleansing truth and devastating consequences that neither could fully anticipate or prepare for. Lightning flashed across the night sky, momentarily illuminating the vast portrait gallery of Thornfield Manor, with harsh brilliance that made the painted eyes of generations of Blackwoods seem to follow the two figures standing in confrontation beneath their watchful gaze. Rain lashed against the tall windows with percussive fury as thunder shook the ancient foundations of the house, nature itself providing dramatic accompaniment to the scene unfolding within. Alexander Ravenscroft paced the length of the gallery, his tall figure casting long shadows across the polished floor as he struggled to contain the tumult of emotions unleashed by weeks of investigation that had led him inexorably to this moment, to this woman, to a truth that threatened to shatter everything he believed about his title, his inheritance, and his very identity. "I have been to the abandoned Blackwood estate," he said finally, his voice low but carrying clearly above the storm. "I have seen the family portrait there, a portrait containing a young girl with your eyes, your bearing, your unmistakable resemblance to the woman in this very gallery." He gestured sharply toward the painting of Elizabeth Blackwood, the resemblance between the long-dead Duchess and Eleanora now glaringly obvious once one knew to look for it. Eleanora stood motionless before him, no longer in servant's attire, but dressed in a simple grey gown borrowed from the housekeeper, her chestnut hair falling loose about her shoulders, her posture regal, despite the modest clothing, as she faced the moment she had both dreaded and anticipated since her return to Thornfield. "I have spoken with solicitors in London, examined records of births and deaths, consulted witnesses who were present at your parents' funeral," Alexander continued, his words gaining momentum as he released the conclusions that had been building within him for weeks. "All evidence points to one impossible, yet undeniable conclusion." He stopped directly before her, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that seemed to penetrate all remaining barriers between them. "You are the lost Duchess of Thornfield," he said in wonder, "and I am nothing but a usurper." Eleanora had prepared herself for many possible reactions, for anger, disbelief, even violence, but the raw wonder in his voice, the absolute acceptance of her claim without hesitation or challenge, left her momentarily speechless. "No," she managed finally, her eyes filling with unexpected tears as the weight of concealment lifted from her shoulders after so many years of hiding. "You are the man who saw me when I was invisible to the world." Alexander stared at her for one breathless moment, then in a gesture that shocked them both, lowered himself to one knee before her, his head bowed in formal acknowledgement of her true rank. The proud Duke, humbling himself before the servant girl now revealed as the rightful mistress of all he had believed was his. "I never wanted this revelation to come as a blow to you," Eleanora confessed, her voice trembling slightly as she resisted the impulse to raise him from his subservient position. "I sought justice, not revenge. You were never the architect of the conspiracy that stole my birthright." "You deceived me," Alexander said, rising slowly to his full height. Yet his tone held more admiration than accusation as he regarded her with new understanding. You infiltrated your own home as a servant, endured countless indignities, including my own arrogance, all while gathering evidence to reclaim what was rightfully yours. Your courage is extraordinary. Outside, the storm began to abate, the lightning flashes becoming less frequent, the thunder more distant, as if nature itself recognized that the turbulent revelations within the gallery were reaching resolution. I have documents proving my claim, Eleanora offered quietly. Correspondence between my uncle and your father, the true will of my parents, birth records and legal entailments, binding Thornfield to the Blackwood bloodline, all that is needed to establish my identity beyond question. I require no documents, Alexander replied with unexpected gentleness. I know the truth when I see it standing before me. The question that remains is not your identity, but what happens now, how we proceed with this knowledge that changes everything between us. Eleanora gazed up at him, suddenly aware of how close they stood to one another, how the revelation of her true self had not created the expected distance, but instead had somehow bridged the final gap between them, transforming them from master and servant into equals facing a shared dilemma. The storm outside had calmed to gentle rain, its soft patter against the windows creating an intimate atmosphere within the gallery, where the portraits of Eleanora's ancestors seemed to bear silent witness to this pivotal moment when truth, long suppressed, had finally emerged, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a foundation for something neither had anticipated, when their paths first crossed in this very room, something that transcended titles and inheritance to touch the hearts beneath the social roles they had been assigned. Thornfield Manor's grand ballroom blazed with light from 100 crystal chandeliers, their brilliance reflected in polished marble floors and gilt mirrors that transformed the space into a glittering wonderland, as the cream of county society gathered for what they believed was merely the formal introduction of the Duke of Ravencroft to local nobility and gentry. Ladies in silk gowns of every imaginable hue moved like exotic butterflies among gentlemen in impeccable evening attire, their jewelry catching the light with every gesture, their laughter and conversation creating a pleasant hum of sociability beneath the elegant strains of the orchestra positioned on the mezzanine above. Alexander stood at the entrance to the ballroom, watching the assembled guests with outward calm that belied the gravity of what would soon unfold, his formal attire immaculate, his bearing regal, yet somehow different from his usual cold reserve, as if an inner fire had been ignited within him that could no longer be concealed. At precisely 9 o'clock, the butler struck his staff upon the marble floor 3 times, the sharp report causing conversation to falter and heads to turn expectantly toward the grand staircase where Alexander now stood, commanding attention without effort as the orchestra fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his deep voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast ballroom, "I have invited you here tonight, not merely for social pleasantries, but to bear witness to the correction of a grave injustice perpetrated nearly a decade ago, an injustice in which my own family played a regrettable role." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the crowd, as Lord Harwick, positioned near the refreshment table, grew noticeably pale, his fingers tightening around his champagne glass, as Alexander continued. "For too long, the truth has remained hidden behind lies and deception, but tonight we shall restore what was wrongfully taken and acknowledge the rightful mistress of Thornfield." With these words, Alexander extended his hand toward a side door, from which emerged Eleanora, no longer in servant's attire, but dressed in a gown of deep blue velvet that had belonged to her mother, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant style befitting her true station, the Blackwood family sapphires adorning her throat and catching the light as she moved with natural dignity to stand beside Alexander. "I present to you Eleanora Blackwood, rightful Duchess of Thornfield," Alexander announced into the stunned silence, his voice ringing with pride and conviction as he placed her hand upon his arm. "And I ask for her hand in marriage, not to secure my position, but because I have come to love her beyond all reason or rank." Gasps of shock echoed through the ballroom as recognition dawned on the faces of older guests who had known Eleanora's parents, while Lady Whitmore and her companions, who had so often looked down upon the quiet lady's maid, stood frozen in scandalized disbelief. Lord Harwick, his composure crumbling under the weight of public exposure, attempted to slip toward the nearest exit, only to find his path blocked by two constables who had been positioned there earlier at Alexander's instruction, their presence previously unnoticed among the liveried footmen. "We have in our possession," Eleanora spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment, "documented proof of conspiracy between Lord Harwick and the late Duke of Ravenscroft to falsely declare me dead alongside my parents, to spread malicious rumors regarding my legitimacy, and to illegally transfer my inheritance and title to the Ravenscroft family while I was but 16 years of age and unable to defend my rights." The proof was presented with calm precision, correspondence and legal documents displayed for key witnesses, while Lord Harwick was detained, despite his blustering protests and threats. The evidence so overwhelming that several of his former allies stepped back in silent distancing from his disgrace. Society ladies who had whispered cruel judgments about Eleanora for years now found themselves facing the woman they had disparaged, revealed as the aristocrat she had always been, her quiet dignity in adversity making their petty cruelties appear all the more shameful in retrospect. As the implications of the evening's revelations settled upon the assembly, transforming what should have been a simple social gathering into a pivotal moment of historical significance for the county, Alexander turned to face Eleanora directly, his expression softening as he took both her hands in his before the assembled witnesses. "I relinquish all claim to Thornfield, and its title freely, and without reservation," he declared, "acknowledging you as its rightful mistress. Yet I ask that you consider joining our families through marriage, uniting our houses not through deception but through love, freely given and received." The opulent ballroom, designed and built by Eleanora's ancestors centuries earlier, seemed to hold its breath as she gazed up at the man who had first dismissed her as nothing but a servant, only to recognize her worth, defend her claim, and ultimately offer his heart alongside the justice she had sought for so long. "Yes," she replied simply, her voice clear and carrying to the furthest corners of the hushed room. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you, as equals in both rank and heart." The announcement was met first with stunned silence, followed by cautious applause that grew in strength as the aristocracy, ever adaptable to changing circumstances, recognized that witnessing the restoration of the true Duchess of Thornfield had transformed them from mere party guests into participants in a historic moment that would be recounted in county histories for generations to come. Summer sunlight bathed the gardens of Thornfield Manor in golden radiance, transforming the carefully tended landscape into a paradise of color and fragrance as roses climbed ancient stone walls, lavender bordered immaculate pathways, and wildflowers danced among carefully cultivated blooms in the natural garden that had been Eleanora's first restoration project upon reclaiming her ancestral home. 1 year had passed since the dramatic confrontation in the ballroom that had exposed Lord Harwick's conspiracy and restored Eleanora Blackwood to her rightful place as Duchess of Thornfield, a year of healing, renewal, and transformation that had affected not only the estate, but all who dwelled within its boundaries. Eleanora moved with serene confidence among the garden beds, the simple elegance of her mourning dress complemented by the delicate Duchess coronet she wore for the annual tenant celebration later that day. Her instructions to the head gardener regarding preparations delivered with the perfect balance of authority and kindness that had endeared her to the staff who had once known her only as a fellow servant. Alexander watched from beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, his expression filled with quiet pride and profound love as he observed his wife in her element, the woman who had entered his life in disguise, yet had revealed herself to be his perfect match in intellect, courage, and compassion, their marriage of equals proving far more fulfilling than the cold dynastic union he had once expected would be his fate. Eleanora caught him watching, and a becoming blush colored her cheeks, still not entirely accustomed to being the object of such open admiration despite a year of marriage to a man who made no secret of his devotion. her gaze softening as she excused herself from the gardener and crossed the sunlit lawn to join her husband beneath the spreading oak. From servant to Duchess, Alexander mused as she approached, taking her hand and raising it to his lips in a gesture that never failed to quicken her pulse. Though you were always the latter, were you not? And you, my love, have proven that true nobility lies not in title but in one's actions. Eleanora responded with a warm smile. You were a true duke even when you thought yourself an usurper. Their conversation turned to plans for the educational foundation they were establishing with portions of both their fortunes, designed specifically to assist those who, like Eleanora, had fallen from social position through no fault of their own, providing training and opportunities that might preserve their dignity while helping them rebuild their lives. The scandals surrounding Lord Harwick's exposure and subsequent trial had revealed several other victims of his machinations, young people dispossessed through similar conspiracies, who now looked to the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield as champions of justice and restoration, a responsibility both Alexander and Eleanora embraced wholeheartedly. I received another letter from Lady Margaret Fontwell, Alexander mentioned as they strolled arm in arm through the garden that had once been Eleanora's refuge and was now their shared joy. Her case against her stepbrother progresses well with our solicitor's assistance. She may reclaim her family property by Christmas. Eleanora's expression brightened at the news, her natural empathy for those in circumstances similar to her own ordeal, evident in the animation of her features as she discussed ways they might further assist the young woman's reintegration into society once her legal battles concluded. Thornfield itself seemed to glow in the summer light, its ancient stones warmed by more than mere sunshine as laughter echoed through halls that had once been cold and forbidding, the manor transformed from a symbol of stolen privilege to a beacon of justice restored, its windows gleaming with welcome rather than watching with suspicion, as they had on that rainy morning 1 year earlier, when Eleanora had stood among the servants awaiting the arrival of the man she believed her enemy, never imagining he would become her greatest champion and most beloved companion. As they reached the rose garden where their relationship had first begun to change from antagonism to alliance, Alexander drew Eleanora into his arms. Unconcerned with propriety now that they were hidden from view by fragrant walls of climbing roses, his kiss conveying all the depth of feeling that continued to grow between them with each passing day. When they finally parted, Eleanora remained within the circle of his embrace, her head resting against his chest as birdsong, and distant voices from the estate created a gentle symphony around them, the peaceful moment encapsulating all they had overcome and all they had built together, a love born of adversity yet flourishing in truth, a partnership of hearts and minds that had transformed them both from cautious adversaries to devoted spouses who faced the future not as servant and master, usurper and victim, but as equal halves of a whole that was greater than either could have imagined when fate first brought them together beneath the roof of Thornfield Manor.